no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
Will is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I'm here with President Rick Esenberg, who joins us as our co-host. In our last episode, we discussed the death of DEI and how we're moving back toward an era of equality under the law. Give that episode a listen if you haven't, but you're not going to want to miss this one. Today, we're shifting to the bedrock of our republic, free speech. As we enter 2026, the battle for the First Amendment has taken an unprecedented turn. So today, we're joined by Professor Donald Downs, a renowned expert of law, journalism, and political science at UW-Madison. He's authored a number of prize-winning books, countless teaching awards, and is a go-to voice on the defense of academic freedom in higher education and on college campuses. Thanks for being with us today, Don. Thanks for being with us today, Rick. Let's get into the episode. Is the restoration of free speech under threat? We've seen the FCC's latest crackdown or attempt to crack down on media bias, and we also struggle to talk about leftist censorship on campus as well as digital spaces. We're breaking things down about the most fundamental right, and so we're going to start with the concept of free speech, the First Amendment. If we just look back to the original text, it talks about it literally says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment in religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. Mr. Downs, so the first question is going to go to you. What makes free speech so fundamental to our republic?
Well, it's fundamentally, to begin with in a more macro way, we're the only country really in the world that was founded, not exclusively, but primarily or to a great extent on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And individual rights, equality under the law, and rule of law are essential to what we are as a people, as well as self-government. And self-government, democracy, Republican democracy, not pure democracy, it's an important distinction, is part of it. And sometimes that's in conflict with the right side in ways that we could be talking about. But those are the three fundamental things: self-government, individual rights, equality under the law. And as Justice Cardozo, in a famous opinion that involved applying the Bill of Rights to the states and to local governments and public institutions like universities, said that free speech is the matrix. It's the matrix that makes everything else possible in a free republic that we have established. And it's unthinkable to live in a free society where there isn't free speech. And that means freedom of thought. 1902 was even imagining the death of the emperor was a capital offense. So there are such things as thought crimes. And of course, we can think about, the Soviet Union, communist China, and other, Nazi Germany. So it's the matrix. That's putting it in a nutshell.
Rick, I feel like you'll definitely respond to some of what Don has said with this question, though. You've said this many times. You talk about the right to be wrong. We've defended this kind of in at times here at Will. But what do you Rick, talk about the right to be wrong. Talk about why that's important.
Well, it's one of the paradoxes of the system that Don has described. One of the things I always say about democracy and the sort of the regime of classical liberalism that Don described is that politically you have to be willing to lose, right? Because committing yourself to decision making, through a process in which you simply don't get to dictate what the result is, means that you have to be willing to accept the fact that sometimes it will come out in a way that you don't want it to. It doesn't mean you want to lose, but it means that you recognize that that's what's going to happen sometimes in a democratic republic. Similarly, in the area of free speech, it's not that being wrong is a good thing. It's that, number one, the ability to express yourself without the fear of being penalized or silenced if you say something that others think is wrong is a positive thing. We all have experienced that in the organizations that we're a part of. I mean, Pat, I'm sure you've heard me say at Will meetings that, I want to hear what everybody thinks. Like, don't tell me what I want to hear, because the creativity and the willingness to go outside the received wisdom is a valuable thing. Always be right, but sometimes it will. Second, although I don't want to say that being wrong is a good in and of itself. Uh, it is, I, I am more fearful of what will happen if some powerful entity takes upon itself the authority to decide who is wrong and who is right. That this authority is no more likely to be, perfect than each of us. And so when we talk about, free speech and the right to be wrong, one of the things that we're concerned about is whether the greater evil is that the government might what will happen if the government takes upon itself the power to suppress points of view that we don't like. I mean, we understand human nature. We understand the weakness of institutions, and to give one of them that type of unfettered authority is generally not turned out well in the past. And this notion that we can somehow um, modulate the public discussion in a way that suppresses only bad views is just it's not borne out by that history. You know, the, people always say, well, what if they would have suppressed the nascent Nazi Party during the Weimar Republic in Germany? The fact of the matter is the Weimar Republic in Germany did not have the free speech regime that we have here in the United States. They did try to suppress and prosecute people for bad speech, including the Nazi Party. And look how that turned out. It didn't work at the end of the day. I think that our view that the remedy for bad speech is more speech, while it's not perfect, I think it's better than all of the other extant possibilities.
So I want to jump into this. If more speech is good speech, let's jump or is better for better for society, better towards what we're trying to accomplish. Let's jump into this. What's happening where the FCC has basically hinted that they're going to go after liberal talk shows for liberal bias. The New York Post, for example, reported 90 liberal guests to every one conservative. So like, in a way, if we were to book more conservatives on the show, like that's more speech. Is that, that's better for what we're trying to accomplish? I guess the question is, do you agree with that? Is that wrong, or is it wrong because the government's the one doing it?
And I think that in itself is a violation of the First Amendment. Networks that run, late night shows are themselves engaged in speech, and we don't want the government to tell them what they will and they won't say, which it would be doing if it dictates what their guest list would be. I know, Pat, that you're going to have a hard time believing this, Pat, but when I was a teenager, I was the same nerd that I am today. And I used to like to listen to talk radio, believe it or not, when I was 14, 15 years old. And there are two things about it that are different than today, other than the fact that it actually was a bit more intelligent. But one, it was it was generally left to center, not exclusively, but generally left to center. And it didn't come on until 10:30 at night. And that was so it wouldn't be subject to the strictures of the equal time doctrine. The Reagan administration stopped enforcing that rule in the 1980s, and that led to the rise of largely conservative talk radio. I mean, we can debate about whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly introduced more speech into the public conversation. We now heard points of view that you really didn't hear a lot when I was that, nerdy teenager in the mid 1970s. So, the fact that people on my side, on the conservative side, are now turning around and focusing their attention on enforcing the very rule whose suspension led to the rise of their movement, I find beyond ironic. And I have to say that the justification for it is even weaker today than it was back then, because we say that we want the media to do something. Well, who is the media? Like, we have this podcast, that we put on, for really didn't cost us much to invest in this. The information market is far more wide open than it was during the reign of the equal time rule with the FCC, where you basically had these three television networks and a limited number of radio stations, and access to mass communication to the public was very limited. It's not the case anymore. And the barriers to entry in the information market have dropped precipitously.
You look at how many people watch or listen to like Joe Rogan. I saw one site that said 90 million viewers overall that he's had over time. And that blows away how many people watch the major networks. So the empirical justification for the fairness doctrine and the equal time doctrine, they're two separate things. So the equal time applies only to candidates or people about to become candidates. The fairness doctrine applies to opinions more broadly. And as Rick said, the Reagan administration buried it. And then later, the FCC just did away with it. But that little thing called the equal time doctrine is still kind of sitting there. And I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is to reinterpret it in an expansive way to try to get at this 90-to-1 ratio that to which you refer. And it's very questionable. Same problems exist. The empirical justification just isn't there as it used to be. Let me go back to Rick's made some really great points about free speech and the right to be wrong. How many wrong opinions have proved to be true throughout history? And take Darwin, take evolution. It outraged, and sort of gets to a point we're going to make later about harmful speech. But there were vast communities in America that were outraged and felt dislocated from the world by Darwin's truths. And I used to, when I was teaching this stuff, I used to make a joke that I don't think the monkeys are very happy to be associated with us either. So there's a lot of harm both sides on that. And yet Darwin has proved to be correct. And a woman from Yale, I forget her name, wrote a wonderful book called Why Trust Science. And she just went through all these examples of assumptions that we made about reality that were disproved over time by the process. Sort of the idea that maybe free speech isn't perfect, but it's better than the alternative, as Rick said, is absolutely right. And it's similar to what Churchill supposedly said about democracy being the worst of all governments, but better than all the rest. Not being so imperfect, but it's still better than all the rest. Same kind of idea. And that fits into the American notion of pragmatism, experimentation. And I would go deeper and say there's a philosophical reason why you have a right to be wrong, because human nature is flawed. And human nature was taken into great consideration by the founding fathers. The whole constitutional design is set up to give freedom to our aspirations, at the same time trying to remedy our flaws. And so we are flawed by nature. And that means you don't want to give anybody, except in a very special circumstance, the power to determine what is truth, what is not truth. And I would argue that disinformation bureau that Biden set up, which the Trump administration did away with, they did away with that. But then they sort of brought in this other stuff under the equal time doctrine, is a violation of human nature. And it's fundamentally at odds with the constitutional assumptions of freedom in relationship to the constitutional assumption of freedom in its relationship to flawed human beings.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the themes of our Constitution is the suspicion of the exercise of power. I mean, they had a very realistic view of human nature and the danger of concentrating too much power in one set of hands. I would only add that it's very important when we're discussing this to get away from an ideological valence. There have been times in our history where, free speech was more strenuously promoted by people on the left. I think recently, free speech has not been strenuously promoted by people on the left. In fact, there have been a number of left to center academics, including law professors, who've written books attacking the concept of free speech. And I think that we entered a period in our history where free speech was more strenuously promoted by people on the right. And now I'm distressed to see some of my colleagues on the right side of the spectrum abandon that commitment to free speech. I think we finally got it right, and we ought not to change that.
Yeah, Rick and I are basically totally on the same page when it comes to that. And I have a law review piece coming out that traces the evolution of what I call social censorship or progressive censorship in the name of progressive causes. And that's something new under the free speech and constitutional sun, because throughout history, the vast majority of censorship came from the right. Traditional morality, a challenge to order, et cetera. And that started changing in the 60s. But the 60s had a lot of good in it. It also had an element of progressive censorship that became more manifest. And Alan Kors and Harvey Silverglate wrote a great book in 1998 called The Shadow University, where they talk about progressive censorship. And I talked about it back then as well. And that took over a lot of institutions. So something we're going to get to a little bit later, I think in part 4 of this discussion. No question that's the case. And so we finally got free speech right, Rick. And now the right is starting to go the other way.
Yeah, I have to, you mentioned Professor Kors. I have to mention that I was at a conference once where he was speaking, and at the time I had just finished a stint as a full-time legal academic, and he got up and he said at one point about the modern university, he said, "My colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania are the nicest, most pleasant, most evil people I have ever known."
That is so often the case. I have written that one of the big problems in higher education is, where did the liberals go? Where were they? How did they let this happen? It could even be the case that the vast majority of them don't agree with what's happened, but they went along with it for a lot of reasons. One is they have their own interests. They don't want to bother. It takes time to get involved with this stuff when you've got a full-time job. The other is collegiality, fellowship. I don't want to offend my fellow colleagues. And also because progressive censorship kind of rang a bell for some of them. They had inclinations in that direction, but they had enough of the old faith of liberal democracy and liberalism to not buy in, but they tolerated. And so through a process of osmosis, over time, we started getting this kind of broader censorship on campus and a culture. I know you talked about DEI last time in your last episodes, that had contributed to a culture that made it much more difficult to pursue the kinds of things we're talking about today. I mean, I was part of it, we all were.
Donna, actually, you brought this up, and we wanted to get to this topic anyway, so this is perfect. Like, left-wing ideology is so embedded in institutions of higher education. And really, I think, and Rick would probably agree, we would all agree on this call, it's really corrupted the mission of academic, free thought, debate, and all of that. Could you speak to just how bad it is, maybe how we got here, and like just and maybe what it means for the future?
Well, let me start by saying, talking about how we got there. It's a lot of things, cultural factors, psychological factors, the triumph of the therapeutic, you can name it. And the fact that liberal ideas succeeded. We got the Civil Rights Act. We got all sorts of legislation to further it. We got all sorts of programs. And so where do you go from there? Well, first of all, it's hard to change society. So liberalism didn't quite live up to its aspirations. And so you started getting people wanting to push for more. Or even if liberalism succeeded, what's the next thing? There's always has to be the next thing. that certain people on the left keep wanting you to push. And so it's an intellectual theories, post-structuralism, postmodernism, etc., working their way into racial theories and a variety of things. And they had a lot of resonance in the academic world. So how we got here is a complicated question. If you've got 5 weeks, maybe we can, go 5 weeks.
Well, I guess a little more important then, what does it mean for, I look at this as like, it is so bad for the students to only be exposed to one viewpoint, to then enter the world and then just have one mindset, right? And so talk a little bit about that.
Well, there is kind of a one mindset in many places. First of all, there's 4,000 institutions of higher learning. I mean, it varies. Some say 3,000, some say 5,000. It's like the sand traps up at Whistling Straits. How many are there? They don't know. They can't count them. And we're talking mainly about the institutions that have gone that way. The elite institutions have done it more. Put it this way, there are far too many institutions that have succumbed to this kind of censorship and inhibition in the culture of intellectual honesty and true dissent.
Well, I think I think students are not being served well by how this is.
Exactly. And FIRE has done these surveys. We did one, Free Speech for Campus, that shows students are afraid to speak out in much higher percentages than are necessary. And that does show the effect of this kind of censorship, both formally and informally, based on programs, based on attitudes, and social media factors into this as well, because students that deviate from the party line get bullied. They're afraid, literally afraid. I don't want to wake up at 2 a.m. to have a bunch of bullies online going after me, that kind of thing. And we haven't got a handle on it, partly because, or significantly because, we have lost sense of our destiny and our mission. And our mission is to educate critical thinking and to pursue truth in a way that prepares our students for living a fuller life as good citizens. We have lost sight of that. I traced some of that in my new law review article talking about the 60s at Berkeley. Free speech movement had these other elements in it. I was at Cornell in the late 60s, and Cornell was one of the first universities to really officially adopt social justice as one of its major missions, competing with academic freedom and free speech. The chancellor of Cornell in 1969 actually was on record or told many of the esteemed faculty there, some who left after what happened in the late 60s, that academic freedom was no longer relevant in the modern world, that kind of thing. So we lost focus on our mission, which is an intellectual mission that contributes to American citizenship. And once you lose that commitment and prioritization, you become vulnerable to going with other kinds of things and where the wind blows. And we have lost that commitment, and we need it back.
We've had so much agreement here that I think I'm going to take this opportunity to see if I can trigger Don. So my view, I don't know if this is my view, but every once in a while, I think that the real problem with universities is self-governance. That because the faculty essentially replicates itself, it tends to select people who are just like the people who are already there. When I was at Marquette, one of my colleagues said that my faculty colleagues have this odd idea of diversity. It means people who went to the same school as they did, held the same jobs as they did, think the same way they did, but have a slightly different hue, and results in this notion, this idea that the term I've often heard used is institutional activist. I was at a panel once, and somebody from the ACLU said the great thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg is she was an institutional activist, and you see that really if you just go to a university, faculty page and go to the right departments, and you can see that that the scholarship that is described by many of the people there isn't really scholarship in the sense of a critical search for the truth, but is a kind of a program of advancing a particular critique of society. And I think that Jonathan Rauch wrote a good book a couple of years ago where he talks about the epistemic constitution, and he talks about one of the things that we've lost sight of is the sense that we all ought to be able to agree that the way we converse with each other, the way we conduct scholarship and other forms of work is, to have some type of objective standards about, what the truth is, and try to conform ourselves to those standards as best as we can, right? That we are going to be critical thinkers. We're not going to engage in intellectual gaslighting. And I don't know that that's the rule anymore on campus. And I think part of that is because the faculty just replicates itself.
You talked earlier, Rick, about paradoxes in freedom, et cetera. And there's a paradox involving tenure. Tenure can be a shield. That was the original intention, because the idea was that the faculty would live up to its responsibilities and its duties to pursue the truth and to defend the truth. You go back to the 1915 AAUP, American Association of University Professors, classic statement on academic freedom and tenure. That was the assumption. But what happens when the faculty no longer lives up to that ideal as much as it should and starts replicating itself? There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was by Ron Kahlberg. I might have the wrong first name. He's a famous liberal guy who's written a lot about affirmative action. He favors economic affirmative action rather than identity politics kind. And he and a co-author looked at the leading journal for American studies and found that out of, I forget, it's like your 90-to-1 ratio in the nighttime TV thing, that all but two were highly critical of America. And the other two were so-so, and that there's something wrong with that. And what's wrong with it is, the main thing is that it selects one point of view and discards the others. I was on a podcast once with someone, and I'm not going to mention the department out of professional courtesy, which is part of the problem, of course, but because I don't know enough about the department to really make the judgment. But they claimed that there's only one way to teach race in their department, and that was critical race theory. And I would say who they were if I knew more about the department and could judge whether they're right or wrong. But that's detrimental. Also, it makes bad education, and it turns out individuals who haven't developed their intellectual capacities.
What should universities be doing to protect students, basically from this cancel culture? Like conservative students who may hold a viewpoint far different than their colleagues. And we'll start with Don, but what can they do? Rick, you can probably take it a little further, and what could others do as well? So Don, go ahead.
Yeah, you start at the formal level. You do away with all the bad codes. And that's what we did at Madison. We were remarkably successful on that. We ended up getting green lighted by fire. We had a group for 20 years that was funded by the Bradley Foundation. It was Committee for Academic Freedom and Rights. And we were involved with fire. We did a lot of work with them and all sorts of things. 20 cases, we won them all. And we also did a lot of policy to abolish our faculty speech code. First university in the country to do so. It was a really interesting thing to be a part of. And so we had people in administration that listened to us eventually. And later on, we even had a head lawyer for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who was someone that we helped pick, or influenced his selection. That's the formal level. But then there's the informal level, and there's the gray area in between. What is DEI, mandatory DEI training? That's either formal or informal, how you want to look at it, but that affects the culture. And that affects what you think you're allowed to say. And all the speech codes in the world that are abolished aren't going to matter if this kind of stuff is going on and creates this informal inhibition and chilling effect on campus. So you've got to start getting programs that are clear about not wanting to do that, even when they're trying to attain other ends. And then you got to stack them with the people that understand the first priority of the university. which is what Rick and I have been talking about. That A, truly believe that, and two, have the stuff to support it and nourish it and defend it. And that starts with leadership. The president of Dartmouth had another op-ed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday or 2 days ago, in which he laid out 5 things universities should do to be amenable to open discourse. And that's kind of the things he talked about, getting the right people in the right places. And then you speak out about it every chance you get. And you kind of create a situation, if you're lucky, where you kind of shame people that are inhibitors of free expression. But that's a long process. I know a lot of people, I'm involved in this in a lot of different levels still. I've been retired a long time, but I'm still involved with all the, and I hear a lot of things from people. And there are a lot of pessimists out there. I'm not necessarily, and I'll finish up and let Rick have to say here, that I'm sort of half full rather than half empty. Maybe just flip it right over. But because in the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous rise of critics. And you get all these new centers on campus that are coming out. Some are good, some are less good. They're better than nothing. October 7th was a shot heard around the academic world, just like Middlebury was back in 2017 or so. That now we have all this money flowing into universities to set up programs, more discussion about academic diversity. So there's a counter movement, and I've been a part of one for over 30 years. When it was first started, like when FIRE first started, actually we started 6 years before FIRE, and we've seen it grow, and it's a nationwide phenomenon now. So this stuff is on the table. Now, Trump helped put it on the table too, but in ways that we need to be very, worrisome about, like for reasons that Rick pointed out earlier. But yeah, so there is some hope, but you've got to keep struggling. Will Sisyphus ever get that damn little rock up to the top of the mountain? That's the question. It's further up the mountain than it used to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, when
WILL, you're part of it too, right? You're part of the distinguished part of this movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to be intentional about the value of this epistemic constitution that I referred to earlier. Um, the notion that the tenets of classical liberalism, and of course by that I don't mean the Democratic Party platform. I mean the regime that Don sort of described at the beginning of this podcast. We have to be intentional about the value of that, and we need to be careful, particularly in polarized times like this, in not falling into the trap of kind of this popular frontism where there are no enemies. If we're on conservative, there are no enemies to the right. If we're progressive, there's no enemies to the left. I mean, we have to we have to privilege these classical liberal rules that our founders were so wise to understand should govern communal decision making in a republic like ours. And so Pat will tell you that one of the things that really turns me off is when I talk about the need to strong arm somebody else's position. To perhaps not rush to judgment when there's a controversial thing that happens in the news, to try to be evidence driven. And if someone's response to that is, "Okay, boomer, you don't know what time it is," that just drives me up the wall, because you know what? I mean, it is absolutely time for us to remain committed to these fundamental principles, and to do so, I think, without fear of whether or not we're going to alienate somebody on our side. I think that there may be some short-term pain in that, but I think that over the long one, it's essential and critical.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Rick is never worried about angering our side, I feel like, and does not it does not hold back, I think, whatsoever.
There's a famous maxim about whose ox is gored or whose oxen are gored. And conservatives really jumped on the bandwagon, and and that I was on, and my colleagues were on. And I was not an individual actor. Wisconsin, we had a really strong group, unique kind of situation actually, and but many of the conservatives jumped on the cause because their ox was getting gored. And that's really, in the end, the test for them was, where would they be when the other side's ox was getting gored? And unfortunately, a lot of them have not stuck to the principle. And that's what's a university is different from other institutions. We're a special institution. Now, that can go to people's heads. Well, that makes us better, it makes us superior. No, it doesn't. We're no better off than anyone. We have no better character than anyone else. Or maybe even worse, depending on the situation. But as an institution, we're supposed to be that middle way. We're supposed to be the light, the candle in the darkness, whatever. And we can't deviate from that. And so wherever the attack comes, left or right, we have to stick to it, like Rick said. Otherwise, we're hypocrites. And I now see, fire. There's a big, Rick talked earlier about no enemy to the right. Fire is coming under attack for defending the rights of Palestinians, protest, etc., because they're not taking the right side. And we know about this big split in the heritage between maybe it's left coast, the West Coast Straussians versus the right coast Straussians. But I was trained by the East Coast Straussians at Cornell. So I'm more on their side, and they were conservatives who believed in liberal institutions in the sense that Rick is talking about, because they saw that it's conducive to maintaining a free society that changes at the same time that it sticks to certain fundamentals. And university is key to that.
I'm sorry, Don. I just your comment about whose ox is being gored reminded me of this moment. It's almost 10 years ago. Is the only time I was ever invited to speak at CPAC, right? Which is, for conservatives, it's a little bit like that bar in Star Wars.
It's exactly what it's like in that whole line of radio talkers and everything, and you go down and talk. It's awesome.
Yeah. So this was 2016. Donald Trump was running for the presidential nomination. I was not particularly happy with that. And so and he had said that he wanted to open up the libel laws so he could sue more people. And I hate this. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get up there at CPAC and I am going to speak truth to power. I'm going to get up at this on this panel, which was about some free speech topic. And I'm going to say that, what we don't need to open up the libel laws so that, powerful politicians can sue people who are trying to exercise their constitutional right. And so I got up and I said that thinking that I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to do it anyway. And what happened was the room burst into applause. This was 2016 at CPAC. The room burst into applause. Everybody was in support of that. And if I had done that a year later in 2017, and I was not asked to do it, I would have been lucky to get out of there with my life.
You'd be booed now today for sure. Great story. Can I quickly say I was at a CPAC one year. I got an award there, and this was academic freedom kind of stuff. And we were back before the award ceremony in the back in the stage behind us, lining up. And I was introduced to a woman from the Heritage Foundation. And she says, "Oh, you're an academic freedom guy. It's good that we have you. We need our kind of academic freedom." And I responded to her. I said, "No, academic freedom is for everyone, not just you." And she gave me this kind of shocked look and walked away.
In keeping down though with your point, you're half full. You say you're a half full guy, and I want to be a half full guy too. It's not maybe not as easy for me, but you mentioned heritage. Well, one of the interesting things about heritage is that everybody left. I used to interact with the Mies Center at Heritage, and there still is the Mies Center. All those people are still together, but they're not at Heritage anymore.
That's right. Have you followed what's happened at the University of Austin, the UTAX? they've been taken over by the harder right than they. Do you know much about UTAX at all?
I don't.
Oh, okay. It's something you should look into. I'll send you a long article in Politico about what happened there. And they were set up to be like our aspiration. They were trying to fulfill our aspiration. And tensions developed between the harder right, one of them led by one of the founders of Palantir, and who's stationed in Austin, and the more classic liberal right, or I wouldn't even call it right or left, just the classic liberal. And Pano Canellis, who was the president of St. John's in Annapolis, left there because he was ordered to make a public statement in favor of Black Lives Matter during the Floyd stuff. And he thought that was a coercion that was not acceptable. And he left and started this experimental college. You probably heard about it anyway, at least to some extent.
Yeah, I know what it is.
And he said, I don't want to be Hillsdale. I want to be open to everything. And he's gone now. They're all gone. Everyone that followed that line, they were purged, more or less. So that's the story of our times, you know.
I did want to talk about defamation lawsuits just because I think there's kind of been two sides to this coin. Rick, I do want you to talk about a little bit more about the difference of what you heard in 2016, how it's but then also how it's playing out now. You know, I think Trump has sued TV stations multiple times. I think there's a standing lawsuit against CBS News. The Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty is not the only firm that has defended people against defamation lawsuits. That continues to play out across the country. How has like the defamation lawsuit in the free speech, you know, with the free speech movement kind of evolved over the last 10 years?
Well, I mean, the law is pretty good on defamation, but the problem is that there's an interorum effect. So I keep talking about what Pat knows, but another thing that Pat knows is that at will, if some public official gets a lawyer to send a letter to some citizen activist or somebody who's trying to speak out, threatening to sue them for defamation, I lose my religion. And and we have stepped up to help a number of those different people. Now, what happens at the presidential level, I mean, these cases that are brought by Trump are not they're not meritorious. They're not going to win. I don't even know what the theory is in this CBS case. I mean, I guess they took out answers where Kamala Harris's tendency to speak in word salads was even more on display than the ones they kept in. I just not a particularly good case or something that should be the subject in an FCC investigation. But I remember a long time ago when I was a young lawyer, where somebody said that no one wants to see a V between their name and the name of their country. And similarly, I think that no one wants to see a V between their name and the President of the United States, because the President of the United States is a pretty powerful individual. And so I think this is a situation where that law, which is pretty good, needs to be bolstered by a culture of free speech and propriety, and a recognition of the fact that you simply don't do this type of thing. And I think that that would be aided if more people on our side had the gumption to criticize this type of thing and say, look, this is simply something that ought not to happen.
Yeah, Anthony Lewis wrote about that a long time ago, about the problem with New York Times versus Sullivan, the famous case involving making it difficult to sue as a public official, et cetera, that just being threatened with a lawsuit was enough to silence you, and that the law itself can't really wrap its arms around that. Rick, here's a case that what your take would be on this. Academic Freedom Alliance, we've been discussing for a long time the utility and a propriety of using libel suits against administrators who lie about the people that they're targeting. And we have some real, Nadine Strauss has been involved in those discussions, and she's very loyal to your position, and to a civil libertarian, giving any kind of credence to or broadening the scope of the application of libel laws is considered just wrong inherently. But in some cases, it's been effective in getting administrators to back off punishing faculty for what they said, wrongfully punishing them or investigating them. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess like so many things, it depends on the particular facts of the case. But I'm reminded of, we've had kind of the same type of debate in the area of hostile environment harassment. So you have these laws that, if you create a hostile environment based upon, race or sex, that can become actionable under various civil rights laws. And a lot of times, conservatives have raised the possibility of doing that to combat, say, DEI efforts, which also can create a hostile attitude based upon race. And my view on that is, if you do that, you have to reserve it to only the most extreme circumstances. And so maybe there's a case where that's appropriate. I wouldn't suggest modifying the applicable legal rules to make it easier. But there could be cases where the facts are such that that type of litigation is warranted.
Yeah. I agree with everything you said.
One of the things before we kind of wrap up that we haven't touched on is just these protests that we're seeing in Minnesota, and I think, and why I'm talking about it is because I think I don't want to talk about it on the immigration side. I think what we want to talk about is, like, what are the limits on your right to protest, your right to speak out, navigate the difference in when just you speaking out is the where the line is when it comes between inciting disorderly conduct versus your right to speak out. And I think, you guys are clearly have established yourself as the experts here on the First Amendment, what it protects, what it may not. So Rick, we'll start with you. Where does that balance come in?
Well, this just reminds me a little bit of, occasionally, folks on the left would reach out to us and say, would you join us in uh, uh, supporting X? And some of the time, what they were asking us to support is is protest that involves not merely the expression or the communication of ideas, but something that interferes with the rights of others, either violates some reasonable time and manner restriction, or shouldn't we support the pro Palestinian students creating a phalanx so Jewish students can't enter a classroom building, or shouldn't we support when Don Downs comes to speak at the back to the University of Wisconsin to speak, shouldn't we support the students that want to get up there and shot him down while he's advocating for free speech? And my answer is, like, no, we don't want to do that. The fact that something is intended as protest or has some expressive element doesn't mean that it can't, by non-expressive conduct, become something that is legitimately regulated. And so, when it comes to the protests in Minnesota, do people have the right to protest against ICE? They do. Do they have the right to hold up their cameras and film what's happening? Yes, they do. Personally, I find that feature of modern life to be kind of obnoxious and off-putting, because I think it distorts relationships between people, but sometimes it's necessary, and they have the right to do it. And do they even have the right to say where ICE is? Yes, they do. They have the right to say that. They're in public. They've observed something that's happened in public. Do they have the right to physically interfere with the enforcement of federal law? No, they do not. And so I think that the problem that we have now is in a situation like this, everybody simply, because we are so sharply polarized, because we all believe that if we give an inch to the other side, it's existential. It's the end of America if we give an inch to the other side. It's either communism or fascism will become inevitable. And I don't think that's true. And I think, in fact, it's when we basically assume the position, and you see this, in these videos of the shooting in Minnesota. I mean, the fact is that these videos present very confusing scenarios. It's not possible to make the extreme statements that are being made by both sides. I think in one video, I think it's a close call, but you probably couldn't get a conviction. In the more recent video, I think it looks bad, but it's kind of hard to know what happened because you don't see all the angles, and there's all these possibilities about maybe there was an accidental discharge of the firearm. But the thing about it is it's like it's a Rashomon thing. I mean, it's people see only what they want to see, and unless we are intentional about fighting against that inclination that we all have to see what we want to see and not see what we don't want to see, that's the thing that will make that will become an existential threat to the republic, because it's at that point that we've abandoned discourse, we've abandoned any hope of people with diverse viewpoints being able to live together, because they won't talk to each other, and they can't talk to each other because they can't even agree on what reality is.
That's such a great way to put it. Thinking about what holds a polity and republic together, some sort of common assumption of where the boundaries are. And Hannah Arendt, in her book The Human Condition, talks about what happens when social common sense dissolves into disagreement about facts that used to be basically common sense. And it opens the door to subjectivity. Subjectivity is a big thing in the law, the difference between an objective and a subjective standard. And one problem with universities is that everything's become subjective. If you feel a certain way, then that's a truth. And we can't make any objective judgment as to whether or not it's reasonable. The reasonable person has become the therapeutic person. Frank Faridy wrote a book about this. He said political correctness has been replaced by emotional correctness. I wish that were my line, but it's not. It's a great line. And that really matters. And that's a predicament that we're in if everything's existential. I mean, Rick has just given us a really great insight as to how polarized society is unable to sustain the values and assumptions that are necessary for meaningful discourse to take place. So in the name of my right to free speech here, you're actually undermining the very condition that makes free speech sustainable, both normatively and I would argue in a practical strategic sense. Now, getting back to the situation in Minneapolis, one of the hard areas is the not just taking pictures, but taking pictures of them and sending them to protesters. And if the objective then is to the people that will get the picture will then obstruct. The federal law on obstruction of federal officers, it has to be some sort of physical obstruction generally, but they allow even just touching an officer without permission has been interpreted by some courts as a form of obstruction. You got to draw the line somewhere. And but what about communication with the intent that others will use that in communication to engage in a form of physical obstruction? And John Yoo has argued that you might have a case there for conspiracy or something. I'd love to hear Rick's take on that. Conspiracy laws are notoriously open to abuse, but there is a difference between taking a picture, then posting it, and intentionally using that picture to further obstruction down the line. And that's a gray area that I think they're going to have to deal with. And I would say one last thing. I think after October 7th and some of the stuff that happened on campus, there's all sorts of gray areas that we've never really adjudicated that well, except maybe some of the time, place, and manner stuff. What happens if you sit in a library where normally you could make a silent protest in and out? But what if they're there day after day after day for 5 hours a day? At what point? Is that a time, place, and manner issue? Probably. Even Skokie, case that I wrote a book about as I got my job at Wisconsin because of that book. And I changed my mind about it, by the way, which is an interesting thing for our discussion. But the Nazis never showed up because they were afraid to. So never really had a test case of what would happen if they had. And they were going to be there 15 minutes and leave. They weren't going to walk through neighborhoods and be there day after day after day for hours on end. So somewhere in there, free speech probably has to stop. At what point does it become something more? I think the post-October 9th cases suggest that has to be adjudicated anyway.
Rick, any thoughts on?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, Don mentioned, I think that, often there's a tension that sometimes is, well, probably almost all the time, is present in our values. There's paradoxes, and there's a lot of line drawing that has to happen in this area. I didn't think the Jack Smith prosecution of Trump for his activities relative to January 6th could ever be based simply on Trump getting up and giving the speech that he gave, because I thought that was protected speech. I think it was, in many respects, reprehensible speech. And I think it was, whether you do it or not, because he was about to leave office, I think it was impeachable speech. But was it a crime? I don't think so. But maybe if you could have shown some level of coordination, some active participation in coordinating with people who are going to then commit violent acts, then you'd have a case. But I never heard that evidence existed.
And it's interesting that Jack Smith never charged him with incitement. And he threw everything, including the kitchen sink, into what he was trying to do. He didn't reach incitement.
We've covered so much on the First Amendment. I think you guys also, we usually end with a smart take, and you guys have both provided a litany of sources you guys, look to. I guess let's change it to a smart takeaway. Like, if there was one thing, and Don, we'll start with you, that you could leave the audience with from this episode, maybe it's even if you don't listen to the first 45 minutes, if you can just listen to this, what is it? Why don't you go ahead and give us that?
Oh boy, there's so much there. I'm going to, I kind of wanted to address this anyway when Rick talked about who decides. That seems like a simple thing. And I used to say, well, that's like, a bubblegum wrapper principle. But the more you get involved in this stuff, you realize that really is where it's at. As a matter of fact, the whole constitutional design is based on allocating authority to make certain decisions to some institutions rather than others. And that's the real danger when you give, you want, Trump's trying to ferret out disinformation, right? Do you really trust someone like him to make those judgments in an objective, nonpartisan way over time? I mean, I got a bridge, that I can sell you in Arizona. So that, and just that, it shouldn't matter related to that. Then I'm done. I think it's come out of what both of us have been saying. Free speech is a special kind of doctrine, and certain institutions are specially established to further those interests. And that has to be something that is prioritized and argued for, distinct from other things that other institutions do and other kinds of law do. It's a principle that needs defending unto itself, and it has to be prioritized.
Well said. Rick, I go ahead and follow that with your smart takeaway for this episode.
I agree with everything Don said, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank Don for joining us on this podcast. Don has been just a tremendous leader on these areas of free expression, particularly in academia. And I have to say, Don, my wife is a University of Wisconsin graduate, and we have Badger stuff festooned all over our house. But she's also conservative, and she gets angry sometimes at what happens in the University of Wisconsin. And I tell her, look, they have a long way to go. On the other hand, I have to tell you that it's my impression that it is not the worst place. It is it is a place in which there is hope, and you were always a big part of that at UW and nationally. But as for my take, I would say that we live in a time where people are on social media. They are far more engaged in expressive activities than they might have been in the past because the cost of doing so has been reduced to almost nothing. But they haven't learned how to do it. And because I'm a lawyer who has been trained to disagree civilly with other people and has been enculturated into this, I will say this. When you are engaged in public conversation with people about public issues, first of all, take their position in good faith. Do not start for the assumption that they are evil, stupid, or insane, because occasionally they will be, but mostly they won't. Uh, Try to find out why they think what they do. Strong arm their position, right? You don't build a straw man, you build a strong man. And then respond to what they say and not who you think they are. And I think you'll find that when you do that, your blood pressure will be lower. You will be a lot less angry. You won't lose as many friends, and you will have much more productive conversations about the issues that concern all of us.
You're here. And let me say I was an honor to be with you, Rick, and the Institute, and Matt, that you guys have done such great work. And, I around the country, I've read pieces about you, and you've had a really productive ride over the last several years. You've done a great job.
Thank you for that, and thank you for joining us, Rick. Of course, thank you for joining us. So that's a wrap on the. Go ahead, Rick.
But Pat, I have just one thing I have.
Go for it. Absolutely.
Because you said, you were going to do this thing we usually do about the book or the podcast or anything like that. So there is a book coming out. I think it's going to be called Wisconsin's First Amendment Legacy, published by the Wisconsin Historical Society. Don, I believe, written the foreword for that, and I have a chapter on our case representing John McAdams, for which Don served as an expert witness.
Yeah, they trapped me on one thing. We never really talked about it, but there's one fact that came up at the very end of that deposition that helped turn me a bit. One that he intentionally put in or seemingly intentionally put in the contact information of that grad student. And then I said, well, so what? That's what they do. And then I forget the lawyer on the other side. He was a Sharpie. He said that they looked at all the other times McAdams has done that. He did not put the contact information of the person he was going after. And that really played on my sympathies for struggling grad students. I think that he just sort of intended people to go after her, and they did. And that made me less of an effective witness for you guys. I felt bad about that.
I remember. I remember that. I mean, and our view was he linked to her faculty page, but one of the things I don't think he intended for people to go after. I knowing John as I did, I don't think he even really thought very much of that. But it does bring into mind, and I don't want to say that John is one of these people, but one of the things I tell people around here is when you're doing free speech cases, if you want to protect the First Amendment, you often are going to find yourself representing somebody who has said something or done something that you never would do. That they probably have pushed the boundaries because, people who act like, people who are, civil and moderate and measured tend not to get into trouble over things like this. We reached that point quite yet. And so sometimes you have to like say, okay, I know they're a little eccentric. I know that maybe they got carried away, but they haven't crossed any lines that make their speech law protection.
I used to tell my students the First Amendment was built on the back of scoundrels. And gave a talk for UW alumni in New York, and one of my students came and said that she still had that maxim on her refrigerator, and she was involved in journalism, and you look at it, I mean, Nazis and Skokie, start there, continue. So not McAdams is not that. I mean,
it reminds me of a scene in one of Woody Allen's movies where they're talking about the Nazis and Skokie, and he's talking to all these pompous New Yorkers, and they're saying, well, I just read a devastating op-ed in the New York Times last weekend, and Woody Allen is sitting there and says, yeah, op-eds are good, but not for Nazis. Baseball bats.
I just want to say for our listeners on the East Coast and West Coast, you've just experienced what a Midwestern goodbye looks like. But we so appreciate Rick and Don for this amazing episode on the First Amendment, and a little bit on political discourse and really academic freedom. We've touched on so much, and this was awesome. And Don and Rick, just great job. So we appreciate it so much.
I love doing it.
Thank you.